Valentine's Day week, which means it is the perfect time to talk about my new favorite hyper niche TTRPG subject, the Fantasy Heartbreaker. We're going to talk about what the term means, where the term comes from, and whether or not it's still constructive to use in 2025. Slight spoiler alert for where it comes from. Now, if this is your first time hearing the term Fantasy Heartbreaker, then congratulations. You are one of the lucky 10,000 people who gets to learn something new today. In this case, you get to learn about a turbo niche phrase that is only used amongst like the most hardcore of tabletop role-playing game nerds. You might as well call us Aang, because we are deep as frick in the iceberg today. Now, there's no one single concrete definition as to what a fantasy heartbreaker is, but from my time perusing Reddit threads and talking with my homies in the Cord, I can boil it down to three broad definitions. A fantasy heartbreaker is a tabletop role-playing game, that's what D&D is, that seeks to unseat the dragon game as the role-playing game people play. Some could argue that 13th Age attempted this, some could argue that Grimwild is currently attempting this, and some people could argue that Pathfinder succeeded at this. Or at least it did like 15 years ago. Now, some folks define a fantasy heartbreaker as any tabletop role-playing game that's even remotely similar to D&D. I think this definition can be kind of stupid because, like, for example, Fellowship is a tabletop role-playing game that's vaguely D&D-ish, but it has zero preconceptions about overtaking the dragon game. It is designed to run one specific kind of campaign, and that's it. But maybe Fellowship isn't close enough to D&D to be considered a fantasy heartbreaker. I'm basically arguing myself at this point. The third definition comes from longtime character on this channel and internet friend of mine, Joseph Fat Crepes LeMay, who defines a fantasy heartbreaker or an RPG heartbreaker as any RPG that is similar to a larger, more successful RPG in the space. Which, whatever, man, I take that one with a grain of salt, but there you go. Do with that information what you will. Now, it's all very well, cool, and done that we have these definitions for what a fantasy heartbreaker is, but like, what's the point in knowing this? What is the significance on our lives? Well, in order to understand the gravity of the term and what it really means, we have to understand the history of where the term fantasy heartbreakers even came from. And to do that, it means we have to go back 23 years to the essay that first coined the phrase Fantasy Heartbreaker. The term Fantasy Heartbreaker was first coined by tabletop role-playing game designer Ron Edwards. If somebody in some basement in like the 80s or 90s coined the term first, then I'm sorry, they should have written it down somewhere. He gets credit. Sorry, that's how it works. Now, if you're like me 3 weeks ago and the name Ron Edwards means absolutely nothing to you, here's a little bit of background on the guy. He created an indie role-playing game called Sorcerer, but more importantly, he made a website and a forum called The Forge that's all about indie RPGs. According to Obese Breakfast Tortillas, The Forge and its forum are essentially the entire source of the hate that OSR, D&D, old school gamers claim to get from indie gamers. Like, there are some genuine gems among Forge posts, whether it's only on theory or game design, but holy hell was it ever toxic too. More on toxicity later. Getting back on track, Edwards published an essay titled Fantasy Heartbreakers on April 1st, 2002. Yes, 2002 was 23 years ago. Doesn't that make you feel old? It makes me feel old for sure. In the essay, he refers to these games that are sort of D&D derivatives, D&D knockoffs, and he praises the drive, the commitment that it took to make these games, but he also says that they're teeth-grindingly frustrating, in that, like their counterparts from the late 70s, they represent but a single creative step away from their source, old-style D&D. And unlike those other games, as such, they were doomed from the start. Why were they doomed from the start? Well, like I said, this essay was written in 2002. In those days, it was a lot harder and a lot more expensive to produce a tabletop role-playing game and get it in the hands of your fellow nerds. You'd have to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get your game printed, and then you would have to cold call like every single friendly local game store in the tri-state area to see if they would even carry it. Add on to the fact that these indie darlings were almost always in the fantasy genre, which means they're competing with D&D. And TSR had way more money than some 90s Dorcas. That means they probably don't have any of the fancy artwork that TSR or like White Wolf could put into their products, and their games probably wouldn't get any supplements because it's so difficult to get just the core game published, there's no way that some passionate gamer from the 90s could get follow-up supplements printed. So it makes it pretty unattractive for a friendly local game store owner. Now, Edwards wasn't being a complete hater in his essay. I mean, he did say nearly all of the listed games have one great idea buried in them somewhere. That's why they break my heart, because the nuggets are so buried and bemired within all the painful material. But on the other hand, he did say each of these games is clearly written by a GM who would very much like all the players to simply shut up and play their characters without interfering with what's really happening. They are social contract time bombs, which the more things change, the more they stay the same. Am I right, fellas? Now, I think despite this sort of asshole-ish prose, Edwards wasn't trying to be a dickhead when he wrote this essay. I think he really was coming from a place of concern for his fellow nerd. Like I said, in the 90s and early 2000s, it was very expensive to make a tabletop role-playing game, so he probably had genuine concern that these passionate nerds would blow their life savings on a project that was doomed to fail financially. Like, I totally get that. He was being kind of an asshole about it, but I do think his intentions were pure. And I don't think he's shitting on all indie RPGs. I mean, he is an indie RPG designer himself. He just says that instead of making D&D derivatives, people should embrace the weird special thing that they initially created their system for. Which there's a really interesting counter argument that we're going to talk about like at the very end of the video. But first we have to talk about the pushback, because of course there was pushback. There's a contingent of people who believe that the term fantasy heartbreaker has sort of outlived its usefulness. After all, in 2025, any idiot with a computer and an internet connection can write up an indie tabletop role-playing game, upload it to itch.io, and then proceed to spam it on r/RPG and every single Blue Sky post they can find. For the price of free $99, they can shove their shit in more faces than any nerd from the 90s could have ever dreamed of. So what's the point of the term now? Well, some people use it as a way to signal that their RPG project that they're working on is more of like a fix for what they perceive as wrong with D&D rather than some sort of like crazy new weird and wonderful system. On the other hand, there is a group of people who believe that the term is elitist and actively harmful to the RPG space. The most passionate argument I could find for this stance comes in the form of an essay written by indie RPG designer Luka Rejic. I know, I had never heard of him before this either. In the essay, Rejic argues that the term fantasy heartbreaker is one of the most destructive and negative things he's ever read in his career as an artist, writer, and game designer. He says that Edwards basically describes any fantasy heartbreaker system as dog shit. Those are my words. And he asks why any reasonable person would ever want to play a game that's designated as a fantasy heartbreaker after reading Edwards' essay, which basically says that they're all dog shit. Rejic then goes on to say, I was doing everything wrong. The games I liked, D&D and its variants, they were bad. Wrong, not fun. Well, the author used fancy words, except for sucky, but they expressed the same thing. Rejic said that because of the Fantasy Heartbreakers essay, he didn't want to make any RPG content for years because he liked fantasy. That was his thing. And he was inspired by D&D. That was his thing. But according to Edwards, any sort of fantasy material that's inspired by D&D is dog shit. Here are his actual words rather than my paraphrasing. That rambling post was a crucial pair of cement boots that confirmed there was no point in writing the games and stories I enjoyed. No point in adding another fantasy heartbreaker to the world. For at least 5 years after reading that essay, I stopped writing and posting about role-playing games. It's 2019 and that essay is still online. A short Google search for fantasy and heartbreaker will show it in all its glory on the first spot. Folks still reference it. Authors still self-deprecatingly make a nervous chuckle and say how their little game is just a fantasy heartbreaker. Well, it breaks my heart to see writers and designers use that term. To surrender their creative independence, their passion, their spark to such a small-minded, petty term. To accept a label that is, at heart, a slur. A slur that implies they have no business acumen, no originality of concepts, no knowledge of actual fantasy, and no critical perspective on game design. I think of all of those young writers, young gamers, young artists who love their Dungeons and Dragons, love making up new classes, inventing elaborate spell lists, drawing ridiculous dungeons, and watching weird actual play videos. I think of them deciding to write their own game, and then of them coming across the two words, fantasy heartbreaker, and then stopping. Now, calling the term fantasy heartbreaker a slur is a little much, but I do see where he's coming from. I mean, after all, he went 5 years without writing or posting about RPG content because he felt that everything he was making was derivative trash. All because of an essay that was written when in the end was still on the Billboard Hot 100. It should come as no surprise that the man feels the term should be cast into the fire! Now, maybe Rejic is just some super weenie hut junior and we should take his essay with a grain of salt. Many of the comments in the comments section of the essay say kinda just that. They say the initial essay wasn't malicious, it was just dated, it was to try and persuade people to not blow a bunch of money on a project that probably wouldn't sell, whatever. So what does Edwards' essay actually contribute in 2025? As we said before, you can produce your own tabletop role-playing game for free now. So it's not like he's saving anyone from blowing a shitload of money on their passion project. So all it really does is tell people who like fantasy and are inspired by D&D that their ideas are derivative dog shit, and they should probably just spend their time thinking of the weirdest fucking thing they can possibly think of and make that. Some of you might be nodding in agreement with this sentence. Some of you can go yourselves. I sound like a broken record on this channel now, but like indie RPG elitism and gatekeeping just bothers the shit out of me. Like, let people make what they want to make. Not everyone is gonna resonate with an RPG about the trials and tribulations of 17th century merfolk where everything is resolved via spoken word poetry. Some people just want D&D but with rechargeable mana instead of that shitty ass Vancian casting. And the best part about all of this is that if someone does write their own RPG that's just D&D but with rechargeable mana instead of Vancian casting, and you really wanted like 17th century merfolk, you don't have to read the RPG that they made. Every single year I don't read thousands of tabletop role-playing games. It takes 0 effort. It's amazing. You should try it. And by that logic, if you're someone who gets really hype over the Dragon game and you love fantasy and you really want to make a passion project, bring it to life, but you've been a little discouraged by this 23-year-old essay, just forget it, dude. Like, forget the essay, make your truth. Who fucking cares? This guy's not gonna read it. Like, none of the fucking dorks in my comments section who want 17th century merfolk are gonna read your project. Like, if it makes you happy, just freaking do it, dude. Like, nobody's stopping you. Don't like, learn from Luca. Don't be discouraged for 5 years because some asshole on the internet said your ideas are derivative. Really taking a brave stance here, am I right, fellas? How could you tell I did a moralist playthrough on my first time playing Disco Elysium?
Moralists don't really have beliefs.
Before I toss to, I'd love to read your thoughts on this. Please drop a comment below. I'd love to learn why gatekeeping people out of doing something they're passionate in is actually a good thing. I have to talk about something else that I found really interesting. No, it's not a freaking sponsor. I wish. Ron Edwards' essay, is his name Ron Edwards? I think it's Ron Edwards. Edwards' essay was panned as early as 2003. There was a comment posted on indie-rpgs.com that I found really interesting as it basically argues the opposite stance of the original essay. User Hardpoint writes, the term fantasy heartbreaker is a snobby, elitist term used by people to gatekeep the RPG hobby by saying that games that might appeal to the widest net of people are inferior than weird passion projects. There is nothing new here, we have been discussing this. He then goes on to say, my notion of a real heartbreaker of a game, fantasy or otherwise, is one that is trying so hard to not be like the other guys that it ends up alienating an aspect of those it wishes to connect with. Read gamers. This comment really made me go, huh. Because I haven't really read anything like it. Most people who subscribe to the mainstream ideas of game design don't even know the weird indie shit exists. And most of the people who know the weird indie shit exists say you need to be as weird and as indie as possible, otherwise go f*** yourself. I'm sure that's not actually the case. Someone's gonna comment that's not actually the case. I'm sure it's not, and it's just, this is the shit we remember. It's the fucking internet, it's not real, who cares? But what do you think? I'd love to read your thoughts on the subject. Please tell me why gatekeeping people out of pursuing something they're passionate about is actually a good thing. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or, you know, maybe Rejic is right and we should call fantasy heartbreakers the FH slur. That's so dumb. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. You know what to do. Here, this is gonna suggest something that I made that you might like. And thank you so much for watching.